Julian's footsteps echoed softly against the cracked linoleum floor as he entered the community center. That low hum of fluorescent light waving overhead like a tired beacon. The faint scent of damp wood and old coffee mingled in the air, grounding him in the tangible world, in a way that made the weight in his chest both heavier and curiously bearable. He held the door open for a moment, too long, then slipped inside the room where the grief support group met each week, the door settling with a muted thud behind him. The space was small and dim, the pale walls hosting a scattering of framed watercolor paintings, generic landscapes that did little to brighten the room, but offered some quiet backdrop for the shared heaviness that filled the seats arrayed in a loose circle. Julian's gaze flickered briefly over the other faces in the room, a smattering of strangers who each carried their own stories etched deep beneath puffy eyes or tense lips. Some sat rigidly forward, like soldiers bracing for battle against their own sorrow, while others slumped back, arms wrapped protectively around themselves. The air was thick with fragile silence, the collective breath held somewhere between sorrow and hesitation. Julian found his chair toward the edge of the circle, a spot he often chose, preferring a vantage that let him slip unnoticed into the background. His hands, restless and cold, despite the room's mild warmth, clutched the fabric of his jeans, knuckles paling, where his grip tightened. The shadows cast from the single bare bulb overhead wove patterns across his face, deepening the hollows beneath his striking hazel eyes and emphasizing the sharp line of his jaw, the subtle cleft in his chin that almost suggested stubborn resolve, if only he could summon it now. Tonight was different tonight. Anxiety tugged tighter around his throat, making his usual careful composure feel brittle, like glass threaded on a wire. He glanced across the circle, catching sight of Caleb. The tall man, who sat with the calm distance of someone used to guarding himself, his broad shoulders slightly hunched beneath the weight of unspoken grief. Caleb's sandy blonde hair was tousled, in a way that looked casual but intentional, and the faint scar above his right eyebrow caught the light, a silent mark of battles fought long before this shared lament. Normally, Julian's world and Caleb's only intersected in this room, their moments brief. A quick nod here, a pause in conversation there. Caleb was always kind, but distant, untouchable in a way Julian conflicted over, partly because of the guardedness, partly because there was a cautious allure in that reserved space between them. But tonight, as Caleb's penetrating blue-grey eyes met Julian's, there was something new, a flicker of recognition, not just of pain, but of something rawer, closer, almost hesitant curiosity. For a heartbeat, Julian thought he saw a trace of the same loneliness reflected back at him. The session began with quiet introductions, names murmured with varying degrees of confidence, each person sharing the loss they carried like an invisible weight. Julian said very little, as he often did, folding his grief inward, the words lodged too stubbornly in his throat. His mind drifted, caught between memories of a father who was never the man Julian needed him to be, the sharp sting of feeling unwanted, misunderstood, unseen. The flickering fluorescent light buzzed overhead, blending with the soft voices until their edges blurred into a comforting murmur. Caleb spoke briefly about his brother, his tone even, but laden with a fatigue Julian recognized too well. The words fell, softly, carefully unspooling a story of estrangement and unspoken regrets. Julian's heart clenched for him, not just because of the loss, but because behind those steady eyes there was a fortress built of walls, strong enough to keep anyone at bay. When the facilitator opened the floor for quiet sharing, Julian's fingers trembled against his knees. Every instinct screamed to stay silent, but the presence of Caleb, solid and quiet, gave him a thread to grasp. His voice, when it came, was low and uneven, words spilling out as though they had been trapped for years. I don't really know what I'm looking for," he admitted, eyes downcast. "Maybe just some reason to keep trying." A pause. Then Caleb's voice, steady, surprisingly warm. Me too. The room seemed to exhale, a collective easing of tension that neither man could quite articulate, but both desperately needed. A simple exchange, but beneath it, a crack in their loneliness, delicate yet promising. The session ended, chairs scraping softly against the floor as people began to rise and gather their things. Julian hesitated, the words stirring in his mind, a quiet rebellion against the isolation he had so long embraced. Outside the community center, the cool night air felt like a shock against his flushed skin, the sharp bite of early spring mingling with the faint scent of rain that clung to the wind. The street was mostly silent, the faint glow of street lamps casting elongated shadows over wet pavement. Julian lingered, his breath visible in the chill, watching as Caleb moved toward the same exit, his steps slow but deliberate. "Hey!" Julian said quietly, stepping forward before the words could retreat back into his throat. Caleb looked up, surprise flickering in those clear eyes before settling back into a calm that seemed harder won now. "Julian." There was a pause, fragile as spun glass, as if both men weighed the risks of the moment of opening up, of letting another glimpse behind the masks. I've never told anyone this," Caleb began, voice rough at the edges, "but my family, they wouldn't accept the part of me they don't understand. Not now, not ever." Julian's heart thudded, strange relief mingling with a familiar sting. "Yeah," he breathed, the word barely above a whisper. "I know that. It feels like being invisible, because who you really are isn't who they want you to be. It's the worst kind of loneliness, isn't it?" Caleb's gaze didn't waver. "Exactly that. Like I have to hide pieces of myself just to survive." Julian nodded, the pressure inside him loosening just enough to allow a cautious warmth to bloom. "I felt that." So many times he ran a hand through his curly dark hair, frustration and hope mingling. "No one outside this room knows the truth about me. My family, my whole life, they'd never accept it. Sometimes it feels like losing them was less painful than living with the silence." Caleb exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry years of weariness. "It's like we're both living in shadows where light should be." Julian stepped a little closer, emboldened by the quiet understanding passing between them. "But maybe here, tonight, we don't have to be alone." Caleb's lips curved into a tentative smile, the scar above his eyebrow softening into something almost gentle. "Yeah, maybe we don't." For the first time in what felt like forever, Julian didn't want to look away. Not from Caleb, not from the fragile connection growing between them under the faint hum of the streetlights and the steady pulse of healing beginning to rise within their shared silence. "I need you," Caleb said, voice barely above the night breeze, but filled with a quiet urgency that made Julian's heart lurch. Julian swallowed hard, the weight of the past still heavy, but no longer crushing. "And I need you too." As those words hung between them, tentative and true, the night seemed to hold its breath, the world outside fading until there was nothing left but the two of them, bound by loss, by truth, and now by the fragile hope of something more. Julian's phone buzzed quietly against the worn fabric of his jeans, the screen illuminating Caleb's name just as the early morning light filtered through his small apartment window. His heart skipped, a subtle but insistent rhythm, born not just of anticipation, but something deeper, something he hadn't let himself feel fully in a long time. They had agreed, tentative but resolute, to meet again next week, to hold on to this fragile connection they'd begun building inside the walls of that quiet community center. The thought sent a shiver racing down his spine, a mix of nervousness and a strange kind of excitement that he wasn't quite sure he deserved. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Julian traced light circles on the worn wood of his nightstand, fingers stirring memories as vivid and painful as the scars he often hid beneath his sleeves. He thought about his family, stern, unyielding, their love, conditional and tight-fisted, like tightly knotted ropes that choked the air from the spaces he tried to breathe in. Queerness was a word that was never spoken aloud in his childhood home, an unmentionable fault line that could crack open everything he'd worked so hard to build inside himself. Any hint of it was met with disapproval, sometimes with silence so absolute that it screamed louder than any harsh words could. He remembered the years of walking on eggshells, the endless masquerade of normalcy that left him feeling hollow, like a ghost in his own life. Every secret smile exchanged in coded glances, every stolen moment of tenderness buried beneath a smile designed to placate, had come at an impossible cost. The ache of existing in the shadow of their expectations had dulled over time. But it never truly disappeared. Now, as the morning sun rose, illuminating dust motes in the quiet air around him, Julian felt that old aches soften, just enough to allow something new, fragile and trembling, to take root. The thought that Caleb had said, "I need you," pulled taut in his chest. It wasn't just a plea. It was a bridge, reaching across the silence that had defined most of his life. Caleb, for his part, wrestled with his own internal tempest as he stepped outside his apartment that morning. The city around him hummed with its usual frenetic energy, but his mind was caught in stillness, trapped in the small prison of guilt and self-reproach. For years, he'd worn the mask of a straight man, not out of deception, but out of fear. Fear of rejection, of loss, of the unknown consequences of living the truth. His family's quiet expectations, his friends' assumptions, even his own whispered doubts, had kept him locked into that role, a performance that slowly eroded the edges of who he was at the core. The small faded scar above his eyebrow twitched involuntarily, an old reminder of a time when pain was physical, raw, and tangible. Now, the wounds were mostly unseen but just as deep. The weight of hiding, of denying parts of himself, even as he grieved the man who had loved him truly and had been taken too soon, bore down on Caleb with crushing force. Yet Julian's presence, his quiet steadiness, his willingness to hold space without judgment, offered the faintest thread of hope. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Their agreement to meet again wasn't just a plan for another evening in a neutral space. It was a lifeline, a tentative promise of something neither had dared to reach for before. It was hope clothed in uncertainty, fragile as glass but no less real. The following week, the community center felt both familiar and charged with something unspoken. As Julian arrived early, nerves tightening his stomach in waves of restless energy. The low murmur of other attendees filled the room, but his focus was on Caleb, on the possibility that tonight they might delve deeper into the part of themselves that had been buried beneath grief and fear. When Caleb entered, his eyes searching and a little guarded, Julian felt an involuntary pulse of warmth spread through him. This was no longer just a meeting. It was a quiet ceremony of trust, a shared exhale after holding breath too long. As the group settled and the facilitator encouraged an open sharing, Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tightening around the edge of the chair. When it was his turn to speak, his voice came out low, thick with the weight of memories. "I want to talk about him," Caleb said finally, his gaze steady but distant, as if reaching into places that still ached too much for daylight. He was everything. My partner. My toughest critic. My best friend. When he passed, it felt like the ground was ripped away, and the rest of me was just scrambling to hold on to the pieces. Julian listened intently, the rising tide of Caleb's grief stirring something long dormant inside him. The way Caleb struggled to find the words, to keep his composure as shards of pain surfaced, made Julian's own defenses begin to crack. The worst part, Caleb continued, voice catching, was the silence afterward, not just from the world, but from myself. I pretended, I pushed down what felt unbearable. I didn't let anyone see the real me, because I was afraid of losing even the memories if I let them in too close. His eyes flickered over to Julian briefly, sharing a fragile vulnerability before looking away. Julian's throat tightened at the raw honesty, and for the first time, he allowed his own voice to break the silence he'd wrapped himself in for so long. "I get that," he said quietly. "There's been so much I never said out loud, things I thought would tear my world apart if they ever got out. I thought silence was safer, but it only made everything lonelier." The words surprised him. Their release felt both terrifying and freeing. It was as if he'd been holding in a storm for years, and now the sky was cracking open, letting light pour through. The others in the room seemed to fade away, the sounds dimming, until all that remained was the steady beat of his own heart and the connection forged in that moment. Their eyes met again, and Julian saw the same fragile desperation mirrored in Caleb's blue-grey gaze. There was no need for words, no need for reassurance or explanation, because here, in the shared space of grief and truth, they were truly seen. Not as broken men defined by loss or fear, but as whole, flawed, yearning souls who had found each other by chance and by need. For the first time in years, Julian didn't feel like hiding. The walls around his heart weren't fully down, but they were thin. He could breathe without suffocating. And as the room slowly returned around them, the steady pulse of healing hummed beneath their silence, a promise that maybe, just maybe, they could face the future together. Julian's heart still hummed from the delicate thread of connection they'd just woven between them. The weight of the group's silence still lingering in the air like a fragile mist. The other attendees shuffled away, voices dipping back to safe distractions, but Julian found himself unwilling to sever the fragile tether he'd just begun to trust. Without overthinking it, he stood, motioning to Caleb with a tentative smile. "Want to grab a coffee?" Julian asked, his voice low, a little rough from the day's quiet unraveling. "There's this diner a few blocks from here. Small, cozy. Could be good for just talking." Caleb hesitated for the briefest moment, then nodded, a spark flickering alive in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Yeah, I'd like that." They stepped into the chilly air together, and Julian felt the pulse of his own nerves, sharp and bright as a fresh cut. The winter's bite was softened by the early evening glow, the streets quieting in preparation for night. The diner was just around the corner, a retro spot with chipped red vial booths and the faint smell of coffee and frying bacon. As they settled into the cracked leather of a booth near the window, Julian watched Caleb's fingers curl around the chipped ceramic mugs, warming against the steam, but the other man's gaze rested somewhere distant. It was oddly comforting. They were two people possessing their own unresolved sorrows, yet cradling something tender between them, an ember waiting to be stoked. "So," Caleb said after a pause, his voice breaking the silence gently, "how long have you been coming to the group?" "Long enough," Julian murmured, stirring his coffee without really looking at it. "Maybe 6 months. I'm not great at asking for help or admitting I need it. I figured maybe if I stayed quiet long enough, the grief would shrink, or at least get easier to live with." Caleb nodded, his gaze steady and understanding. "I thought silence was the way too," he admitted. "That if I didn't speak about it, it wouldn't be real. But grief doesn't care about silence. It finds cracks and crawls inside." Julian's smile was bitter but genuine. "Exactly. It's that living with a constant companion you never wanted, but can't shake." A silence fell between them again, in no way uncomfortable. There was space for it here. California had slipped under snow, but Julian felt the warmth of Caleb's presence as absolute as sunshine. Something he hadn't expected when he crossed the threshold of the community center that evening. "I guess we're both a little scared," Julian said quietly, voice dropping to a near whisper now that they were private. "There's more than grief. You know, I haven't told anyone in my family who I really am. I'm terrified they'll just pull away. Or worse." For the first time, Julian looked up and met Caleb's eyes. "I'm scared I'll lose everything if I come out." Caleb's expression softened, small wrinkles gathering at the corners of his eyes, as if laughter and sorrow had etched themselves there in equal measure. I get that, he said. Believing that who you are could make people you love turn away, that's one of the loneliest fears. Julian felt a flicker of hope in those words, fragile but real. I don't know if it's safe yet, Julian confessed. Being honest this time feels like standing on a ledge, with every wind threatening to push me off. Resting his hand against Julian's, brushing his fingers lightly over the veins and bone beneath the skin, the touch wasn't hasty or desperate, just steady and grounding. You're not alone here, Caleb said softly. Not with me. You can lean on me if you want. No judgment, no pressure. They sat that way for a moment longer, the din of the diner gentle around them, clinking dishes, murmurs from the few other patrons, the low hum of the jukebox. Tempest, it was a quiet tempest of ordinary life, juxtaposed against the extraordinary bare vulnerability between them. Julian swallowed hard, emotions roiling beneath the surface. There was a story curled inside him, a chapter he'd kept secret for years, one that seemed to pulse with the rawest edges of his fear and loneliness. Wed. Yet something about Caleb, the quiet strength in his gaze and ease in their fragile closeness, coaxed the words out. There's something I never told anyone, Julian began, voice thick with unshed emotions. From when I was a kid, it's part of why I shut down. Caleb leaned in just a little, his attention full and unbroken. Encouraging but patient. When I was 12, Julian said, the memory twisting in his chest. I had this god-awful moment when my dad found my notebook. I'd been writing about this crush I had, on my best friend at the time. I was terrified anyone'd see, but mostly I was terrified of what he'd think. He paused, the weight of those memories looming large as Caleb's hand stayed warm beneath his own. My dad never said a word. Not at first. But the way he looked at me after, like I was some kind of disappointment. It destroyed something inside me. I remember hiding in the basement, just sobbing, feeling like I had betrayed everything he believed in. Julian's voice broke, the years of pain and the rawness of that moment spilling freely now. I swore back, then I'd never be myself again. That, whoever I truly was, I'd bury it deep and never let it see the light. That's been my path, ever since, running from myself. Caleb's eyes darkened with something fierce and protective. His voice was steady, gentle. That's a heavy burden to carry alone. Julian swallowed his tears, staring down at the coffee swirling in his mug. He felt exposed, raw, but also unshackled in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be before. I don't want to be that scared kid anymore, Julian whispered. But I'm also so damn afraid of what coming out means. The rejection, the loneliness, the possibility that I could lose the few people who still matter. Caleb reached a little closer, the space between them shrinking. The diner's cramped booth suddenly felt intimate, a sanctuary carved out from the everyday hum of life outside. You're not that kid anymore, Caleb said softly. You're here, telling your story. That takes so much courage, and if anyone can handle the truth about you, it's me. There was a charged stillness between them, the air thick with unspoken feelings and the fragile beginnings of something more. Julian could feel the heat radiating from Caleb's hand, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, just a breath away. He looked up again, catching the way Caleb's eyes shone in the soft overhead light, sincere and unguarded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The emotional intensity hung suspended, as if the world had pulled back its layers just so these two could exist in this space alone. Julian's heartbeat thundered in his ears, loud enough to drown out the low clatter of dishes and the murmur of distant laughter. The vulnerability between them was no longer just about grief. It was a quiet, urgent need for connection, for reassurance, for a refuge. Caleb's gaze softened further, the hint of a tentative smile curving his lips. How about we take this one step at a time? No rush, just you and me figuring it out. Julian nodded. a breath of relief breaking through the tension. The walls around his heart weren't just thin anymore. They were starting to crumble, brick by brick, in the quiet warmth of that tiny diner booth under the dim glow of neon and shared secrets. And for the first time, Julian let himself hope that maybe he didn't have to face his fears alone after all. Days slipped by, threaded with the steady pulse of text messages that flickered between their phones like a lifeline. Julian found himself lighting up at Caleb's name appearing on his screen, the heaviness in his chest softening, even if only for a moment. But beneath the flicker of warmth, the cold hand of fear gripped him tighter each day. The messages were often the same, simple check-ins and small jokes, but always the unspoken question lurked in his mind. How could he possibly share this side of himself with the family that had never shown him understanding, that would never know the real Julian without turning away? One evening, as the sky dimmed to purple in his apartment window, Julian stared at the typed words he just sent. Asterisk. I don't know if I can ever be who I really am with them. I feel like I'm living a lie every day. Asterisk. The reply came almost immediately, Caleb's blue-grey eyes seeming to pierce through the anxiety even from miles away. Asterisk. You deserve more than that, Jules. You deserve a life where you don't have to hide. Asterisk. Julian's fingers trembled as he typed back, hesitating over the idea Caleb had planted in his mind earlier that day. Asterisk. What if we just left? Not to run away, but to find a place where we can be ourselves. He swallowed hard, doubting he had the courage to say it aloud, even in text. Asterisk. A fresh start. No judgment. Asterisk. The reply brought a pulse of hope. Asterisk. I thought the same. Not an escape, a choice. You, me, somewhere. No one tells us we're wrong for being who we are. Asterisk. That night, Julian lay awake, Caleb's words weaving through his mind, pushing past the dread of rejection. A strange, tentative plan took shape, one where the future wasn't defined by fear, but by possibility. It terrified him, yes, but also filled him with a quiet thrill. Maybe, just maybe, this could be more than a fleeting thought. At the next grief group, Julian arrived early, his steps hesitant but steady. The room was still empty, except for Caleb, already seated near the window, tracing patterns on his coffee cup. Way. Their eyes met and a smile broke across Caleb's face, a sunrise breaking through the lingering shadows of grief. Julian slid into the seat beside him, the two bodies close yet careful, as fragile and tentative as glass. For a while, silence wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Julian's thoughts swirled, memories of his loss tangled with fear of the future and a quiet yearning he was still learning to name. It's hard, Julian finally breathed, voice barely louder than the whisper of rustling autumn leaves outside. Feeling like I'm stuck between who I lost and who I'm afraid to be. Caleb nodded, his gaze soft. I get that. I've lost more than I thought I could bear, but I'm still here. And I think, maybe we don't have to carry this weight alone anymore. Julian's heart ratcheted tight in his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Then, almost instinctively, Caleb reached over, his hand hovering for an uncertain moment, before gently enclosing Julian's. The contact was light, deliberate, a wordless promise. Julian's fingers curled around Caleb's with surprising ease. He didn't pull away. Instead, a quiet heat blossomed between them. The room's chill faded into something softer, kinder. For the first time since that initial meeting, the heavy shadow of grief didn't feel like a cage, but a shared space where two broken things could begin to piece together something whole. Thank you, Julian whispered, voice thick but honest. For this, for being here. Caleb's thumb brushed over Julian's knuckles. Always. A week later, the air was crisp with the faint scent of pine as Julian unlocked the door to his secluded cabin, outside town. The cabin was modest weathered wood, a porch that creaked underfoot, windows that framed the endless stretch of forest like vivid paintings. Julian's breath caught. This place was his sanctuary, stripped of judgment and the busy noise of the world, where time seemed to slow to a pace his anxious heart could keep up with. Caleb's eyes glimmered with quiet awe as he stepped inside, taking in the rustic charm and the feeling of isolation from everything they'd left behind. "It's perfect," he said, voice low, reverent. Julian nodded, letting a genuine smile lift the corners of his mouth. "It's the only place I can really be me. And I want you to see that side, without the grief, without the masks." They settled into the easy rhythm of the cabin, the crackling fire, the shared meals by candlelight, the way the forest wrapped around them like a protective blanket. Between conversations and comfortable silences, Julian's guard slipped further than he thought possible. He told Caleb stories he'd never shared. Hopes and scars wove through his words, and Caleb listened, not just hearing but understanding. And when Caleb shared fears of his own, Julian held space for them too. No judgment, only presence. The weekend stretched wide ahead of them, days filled with quiet moments, tracing finger paths along the moss-covered stones, sipping coffee on the porch as dawn blanketed the sky in gold, long talks that unraveled the tightly wound cage inside Julian's chest. In this small haven, the past's relentless grip loosened. They weren't just survivors of loss anymore. They were creators of something new. On the final night, Joel stood beside the glowing embers in the fireplace, the cabin hush around them like an unspoken vow. Caleb's shoulder brushed Julian's warmth, spreading through a cold uncertainty Julian hadn't dared to name aloud before. "I didn't expect any of this," Caleb said softly, his voice threading through the smoke and shadows. "Falling for you. It caught me off guard. I never thought this would be possible for me." "Not with you." His hand found Julian's again, fingers entwining like roots anchoring them both. Julian exhaled slow, the tension inside him melting with the flicker of hope. I need you too," whispered, voice low and trembling, the words hanging sacred between them. They settled side by side, shoulders touching, breath mingling in the cool night air. No promises were made, no grand declarations, only the raw, steady presence of two souls leaning in towards something uncharted, fragile and real. The cabin outside the noise of the world felt like a quiet harbor, a place where they could begin to build a life not dictated by grief or fear, but by choice and connection. In that simple sacred moment, Julian finally let himself believe in tomorrow, not as a distant, impossible dream, but as a gentle unfolding, bright with possibility.